We don't need uneducated farmers in worn-out overalls holding up progress with their outdated concerns. The cruel words echoed through the town hall as 68-year-old Frank Harrison stood frozen in humiliation. But the next morning, when 3 black government helicopters descended on the town square, Mayor Victor Chambers' smug expression shattered as the distinguished man in military decorations who emerged introduced himself. "I'm General James Harrison, United States Department of Defense Strategic Resources Division, and Frank Harrison is my father. I believe we need to discuss your dismissal of his warnings about your development plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The Pinecrest Town Hall meeting had been contentious from the start. Mayor Chambers had called this special session to finalize approval for the Silver Lake Resort development, a $150 million project that promised to transform the struggling agricultural community into a luxury destination. With unemployment hovering at 12% since the closure of the lumber mill, many residents were eager for the jobs and economic revival the resort promised. The Grand Council Chamber, with its recently renovated interior and digital presentation screens, reflected the mayor's vision for a modernized Pinecrest. The original wooden benches had been replaced with sleek ergonomic seating, and the humble podium where generations of locals had aired their concerns had been upgraded to an impressive multimedia station where Mayor Chambers now commanded attention with practiced authority. At 52, Victor Chambers represented a new breed of small-town politician. His tailored suits, MBA credentials, and connections to state-level developers had propelled him to office on promises of economic revitalization. The former investment banker had returned to his hometown after 20 years away, positioning himself as someone who understood both local values and modern economic realities. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, standing before digital renderings of the proposed resort, "tonight we take the final step toward Pinecrest's future. The Silver Lake Resort represents not just jobs and tax revenue, but a new identity for our community. Our children will no longer need to leave to find opportunity. It will be right here." The crowd of nearly 300 residents applauded enthusiastically. Most were dressed in their best attire for this momentous occasion, representing local businesses, school administration, and various community organizations. The front rows were reserved for representatives from Apex Development Corporation, the company behind the resort proposal, their polished appearance marking them as distinctly different from the locals, despite their friendly demeanor. "Before we proceed to the final vote," Chambers continued, "our policy requires that we open the floor for any final public comments. Please keep remarks to 2 minutes, and remember that all environmental and economic impact studies have already been thoroughly reviewed and approved by the Council." Several residents approached the microphone to express enthusiastic support. The owner of the local hardware store spoke about anticipated construction supply contracts. The high school principal praised the internship opportunities that would be available to students. Each positive comment reinforced the narrative that Pinecrest was unanimously embracing its transformation. Then Frank Harrison slowly made his way to the center aisle. At 68, his weathered face and calloused hands testified to decades working the land at Harrison Family Farms, one of the oldest agricultural operations in the county. His faded overalls and work boots seemed out of place among the business casual attire most had chosen for the occasion. Mayor Chambers' smile tightened slightly as he acknowledged the elderly farmer. "Mr. Harrison, you have 2 minutes." Frank approached the microphone with unhurried dignity. "Thank you, Mayor. I won't take long. I've reviewed the water usage projections for the resort, and I have serious concerns about the impact on our aquifer. particularly for those of us with farms downstream from the proposed development site. A subtle ripple of impatience moved through the crowd. This wasn't the first time Harrison had raised objections to the project. The geological surveys indicate that the resort's planned 3 wells will draw from the deep aquifer that feeds Coyote Creek, Frank continued, his voice steady. During drought years, which we're experiencing more frequently, this could completely deplete the water supply that 5 multi-generational farms depend on. Chambers interrupted smoothly. Mr. Harrison, as we've explained in previous sessions, the environmental impact study addressed water concerns. The resort will implement state-of-the-art conservation measures and, with respect, Mayor, Frank persisted, I've studied those reports. They're based on average rainfall patterns from 1980 to 2000. They don't account for the significant changes we've seen in the last decade. I have records of water table measurements from our farm going back 50 years that show. Mr. Harrison, Chambers cut in more firmly, the environmental consultants who conducted these studies have advanced degrees in hydrology and environmental science. While we appreciate your observations, as a farmer, the council must rely on certified expert analysis rather than anecdotal evidence. Frank opened a worn leather folder he'd brought with him. These aren't just observations, Mayor. I've documented the seasonal variations and can demonstrate that the projected water usage would... I'm afraid we need to move on, Chambers said, gesturing to the timekeeper. Your 2 minutes have expired, and we have other matters to address before the vote. Please, Frank said, his voice remaining measured despite the dismissal. This isn't about stopping progress. It's about ensuring that this development doesn't unintentionally destroy the agricultural foundation that has sustained Pinecrest for generations. Just give me 2 more minutes to explain the water table data. Mayor Chambers' expression hardened. Mr. Harrison, our procedures are clear. Each citizen gets 2 minutes, no exceptions. We appreciate your participation, but this meeting needs to proceed according to schedule. Frank stood his ground. Victor, I've known you since you were a... Boy, this isn't like you. Something this important deserves full consideration. The mayor's professional veneer cracked slightly at the personal appeal. His voice took on a sharper edge as he addressed the room rather than Frank directly. Ladies and gentlemen, while we respect our agricultural heritage, we cannot allow nostalgia and resistance to change to hold our community hostage. We don't need uneducated farmers in worn-out overalls holding up progress with their outdated concerns. This project represents Pinecrest's future, and that future requires us to embrace expertise and innovation, not cling to the past. A pained expression crossed Frank's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully closed his folder and stood with quiet dignity that seemed to rebuke the mayor's outburst without a word. My formal education may have ended after high school, Mayor Chambers, but 50 years of working with the land has taught me lessons that won't be found in any textbook. I hope for all our sakes that I'm wrong about the water table. Pinecrest Valley stretched across 30 miles of fertile land nestled between the Blue Ridge foothills and the winding Coyote Creek. For nearly 2 centuries, the region had been defined by its agricultural abundance, first as homesteads, then family farms, and most recently as a patchwork of struggling agricultural operations interspersed with parcels sold off to developers. The town itself had evolved from a simple farming community into a small rural hub with about 8,000 residents. Main Street featured a mix of century-old storefronts with newer additions. A Starbucks occupied what had once been Henderson's feed store, and the old Thompson Hardware had been converted into an artisanal gift shop catering to the weekend. Tourists who occasionally ventured out from the city. At the physical and symbolic center of Pinecrest stood the town hall, a stately brick building constructed in 1912. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Its recent $1.2 million renovation had been Mayor Chambers' first major initiative after taking office. The traditional wooden interior had been replaced with sleek, modern finishes, and a digital sign now displayed upcoming events where a simple bulletin board had once hung. The renovation divided public opinion. Some saw it as necessary modernization. Others viewed it as an unnecessary expense that symbolized the mayor's prioritization of appearance over substance. This divide mirrored the broader tension emerging in Pinecrest, a struggle between preserving agricultural traditions and pursuing economic reinvention. For generations, the farms surrounding Pinecrest had provided both livelihood and identity for its residents. Children grew up understanding seasonal rhythms. Local families were known by the crops they specialized in, and the annual harvest festival remained the community's most cherished tradition. But economic realities had slowly eroded this foundation. Global competition drove down crop prices, while operational costs steadily increased. Young people increasingly left for college and never returned, seeing little future in the demanding work of farming. The closure of the county's lumber mill 3 years earlier had eliminated 200 jobs, pushing unemployment to crisis levels and forcing many multi-generational farmers to sell portions of their land to make ends meet. Victor Chambers had returned to Pinecrest with perfect timing to capitalize on this vulnerability. Having left as a teenager with dreams bigger than what the small town could offer, he had built a successful career in commercial real estate financing before setting his sights on hometown politics. His campaign slogan, "Honoring our past, building our future," resonated with residents desperate for economic relief while anxious about losing their community's character. Once elected, Chambers established the Pinecrest Economic Revitalization Committee, composed primarily of business owners who supported his vision of transforming the town into a destination for wealthy urbanites seeking weekend escapes. The Silver Lake Resort became the centerpiece of this strategy, a luxury development featuring a hotel, spa, golf course, and high-end residential community to be built on 500 acres of former farmland surrounding the natural spring-fed lake. Frank Harrison's farm sat 3 miles downstream from the proposed development. Harrison family farms had operated continuously since 1876, passing through 5 generations of stewards who had maintained detailed records of everything from soil conditions to water table measurements. At its peak, the operation had encompassed 800 acres of diverse crops and livestock. Now reduced to 220 acres, the farm focused primarily on organic vegetables and heritage grain varieties that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets in nearby cities. The conflict between Frank Harrison and Mayor Chambers represented more than a disagreement over a single development project. It embodied the fundamental question facing communities across rural America. Could economic progress coexist with environmental stewardship and cultural preservation, or did choosing one necessarily mean sacrificing the others? As Frank Harrison was escorted back to his seat following his attempted intervention at the town meeting, the tension in the council chamber was palpable. Those who sympathized with his concerns remained silent, unwilling to risk public association with the suddenly controversial figure. The Apex Development representatives exchanged knowing glances, having encountered similar resistance in other communities where they had built resorts. Mayor Chambers quickly recaptured control of the meeting's narrative. Now, let's proceed. With our agenda, the Council has before it Resolution 2287, approving the final permits for the Silver Lake Resort development. All environmental, economic, and infrastructure requirements have been satisfied according to state and local regulations. The Planning Commission has recommended approval by a vote of 5-0. The 4 council members, all elected on similar pro-development platforms as the mayor, nodded in agreement. The vote that followed was quick and unanimous, with each aye punctuated by enthusiastic applause from most attendees. "This is a historic moment for Pinecrest," Chambers declared, shaking hands with the Apex CEO as cameras flashed. "Construction will begin next month, with completion projected in 18 months. I want to thank everyone who contributed to making this vision a reality. The future of Pinecrest begins today." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about promised jobs and economic revival, Frank Harrison quietly gathered his materials. Several long-time neighbors nodded respectfully in his direction, but maintained their distance, not wanting to be seen as opposing the town's new direction. Outside in the town square, Harrison stood beside his weathered pickup truck, the folder of water table data still clutched in his gnarled hands. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut hay from distant fields, a reminder of the agricultural cycles that had governed life in this valley for generations. He pulled out his phone and hesitated before making the call he had hoped to avoid. His son had made it clear years ago that he had no interest in returning to Pinecrest or the farming life, choosing instead a military career that had taken him around the world. They maintained a loving but distant relationship, connecting primarily during holidays and occasional visits. "James, it's Dad," he said when the call connected. "I'm sorry to bother you with local matters when I know you're busy with important work. There's a situation here with the Silver Lake development. They've approved the project without addressing the aquifer concerns." No, don't worry about that. They just asked me to stop talking at the meeting. "Yes, I'm fine, just concerned about the water supply for our farm and the others downstream. I thought you might know who I could contact at the federal level about a hydrological review." As Frank ended the call and climbed into his truck, he didn't notice Mayor Chambers watching from the town hall steps, a satisfied expression on his face. In the mayor's mind, the final obstacle to his vision for Pinecrest had been neutralized. The old farmer's concerns dismissed alongside the outdated way of life he represented. He had no idea that his triumph would be remarkably short-lived. Dawn broke over Harrison family farms, as it had for nearly 150 years, painting the weathered red barn and white farmhouse with golden light. Frank Harrison had already been awake for an hour, continuing the early rising habit formed over a lifetime of agricultural work. At 68, his movements were slower than in his youth, but retained a deliberate efficiency born of decades of practice. Standing on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, Frank surveyed the 220 acres that remained of what had once been an 800-acre operation. The carefully tended rows of organic vegetables stretched toward the horizon, while heritage wheat varieties swayed gently in the morning breeze. Beyond his property line stood the abandoned Peterson Farm, recently sold to Apex Development as part of the Silver Lake Resort project, its fields already beginning to return to wild growth after a year without cultivation. Frank's weathered face betrayed little emotion, but his pale blue eyes reflected a depth of feeling as he contemplated the changes coming to the valley. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders shaped by manual labor, he maintained an imposing physical presence despite his age. His calloused hands and sun-leathered skin told the story of a life spent working outdoors, while the reading glasses perched on his kitchen table beside dog-eared agricultural journals suggested a mind as active as his body. Unlike the caricature of the stubborn, change-resistant farmer that Mayor Chambers had painted at the town meeting, Frank had consistently adapted his operation to changing markets and environmental conditions. When conventional crop prices plummeted in the 1990s, he had transitioned to organic methods and direct marketing. When climate patterns shifted, he researched and implemented water conservation techniques that reduced his irrigation needs by 40%. He had embraced technology where it made sense, using soil monitoring sensors and weather prediction software to optimize his planting schedule. What Frank resisted wasn't change itself, but change that ignored natural systems and historical patterns. His leather-bound farm journals, maintained meticulously since his great-grandfather's time, documented the relationship between rainfall, groundwater levels, and crop yields across generations. This accumulated knowledge informed his concerns about the Silver Lake Resort's water usage plans in ways that computer models based on limited data couldn't capture. 15 miles away, in the renovated former bank building that now served as Pinecrest's most upscale apartment complex, Mayor Victor Chambers completed his morning workout routine. At 52, he maintained the trim physique and energetic presence that had served him well in both business and politics. His penthouse apartment overlooked the town square, providing a daily view of the community he was determined to transform. Chambers' perfectly tailored appearance, from his precisely cut salt and pepper hair to his custom-made Italian shoes, projected the success story he had crafted for himself. Born to a middle-class family in Pinecrest, he had escaped what he viewed as the limitations of small-town life, earning an MBA from Wharton and building connections in financial circles that eventually enabled his return as a conquering native. Son rather than just another local, the mayor's desktop displayed the latest renderings of the Silver Lake Resort, images he had reviewed countless times, yet still found deeply satisfying. The project represented not just economic revitalization for Pinecrest, but personal vindication. He had returned to prove that his vision for prosperity was superior to the agricultural traditions that had failed to prevent the town's economic decline. Unlike the heartless developer caricature that his critics sometimes painted, Chambers genuinely believed his approach would benefit the community. The resort would create jobs, increase property values, and generate tax revenue for improved schools and infrastructure. If some outdated farming operations became collateral damage in this progression, that seemed a reasonable price for collective advancement. What Chambers resisted wasn't tradition itself, but the way tradition could become an excuse for stagnation. His father had worked 30 years at the lumber mill, spending evenings lamenting missed opportunities while never taking risks to improve. His situation, Victor had vowed as a teenager never to follow that path, and his determination to prevent Pinecrest from continuing its economic decline stemmed partly from this personal history. What neither man fully recognized was how similarly stubborn they were beneath their different exteriors, both deeply convinced of the correctness of their vision, both committed to fighting for what they believed would best serve the community's future. As the morning progressed, both men continued their routines, unaware that events set in motion by Frank's phone call the previous evening were already unfolding. At Harrison Family Farms, Frank completed his morning chores before settling at his kitchen table with the leather folder containing his water table documentation. He spread out handwritten charts showing the seasonal fluctuations in well depths across 50 years, alongside more recent computer-generated models he had created with help from an agricultural extension agent at the State University. The data told a clear story to anyone willing to see it. The aquifer that fed both Coyote Creek and the wells of surrounding farms had been steadily declining over the past decade due to changing precipitation patterns. During drought years, which had increased in frequency, the water table dropped to critical levels by late summer. The Silver Lake Resort's planned usage would likely drain the aquifer beyond recovery during such periods, potentially leaving downstream farms without irrigation water during crucial growing seasons. Frank carefully organized these materials, adding printed copies of the resort's water usage projections from the environmental impact report, with his own calculations noted in the margins. Whatever happened next, he wanted to ensure the scientific evidence was clearly presented. At town, all Mayor Chambers arrived for an early meeting with the Apex development team to discuss accelerating the construction timeline. The unanimous council vote had cleared the final regulatory hurdle, and the developers were eager to break ground before any potential complications arose. "I've arranged for the groundbreaking ceremony next Friday," Chambers informed the Apex CEO. "The governor has confirmed he'll attend, along with the state commerce secretary. We'll have full media coverage, perfect visibility for both the project and your company." "Excellent work, Victor," the CEO replied, using the familiar form of address they had adopted as their professional relationship evolved into friendship. "Our investors are extremely pleased with how smoothly this process has gone. Your handling of the opposition yesterday was particularly impressive." Chambers allowed himself a satisfied smile. Frank Harrison represents the past. His concerns might have carried weight 20 years ago, but people understand now that we need to embrace change to survive. The town has moved beyond subsistence, farming as its identity. Still, these local characters can sometimes rally surprising support, the developer noted. "We've seen projects delayed for years by determined opposition, even after approvals seemed secure." "Not here," Chambers assured him confidently. "Harrison is respected for his family's history, but he's essentially alone in his resistance. The economic benefits are too compelling for anyone to seriously support his position." The mayor had no way of knowing that at that very moment 3 military helicopters were being prepared at a base 200 miles away, or that the man authorizing their deployment carried both the Harrison name and sufficient government authority to temporarily halt any development project in the country on grounds of national security or resource protection. By mid-morning, life in Pinecrest continued with its normal rhythms. Shopkeepers opened their stores, school buses collected children, and farmers tended their fields. The excitement from the previous night's council decision remained the primary topic of conversation, with residents speculating about job opportunities and the transformative impact the resort would have on their quiet community. No one suspected that within hours the town's direction would again hang in the balance, or that the elderly farmer, so dismissively removed from the microphone, would return with the full weight of federal authority behind his environmental concerns. By mid-afternoon, word had spread throughout Pinecrest that Mayor Chambers had scheduled an impromptu press conference on the town hall steps. Local business owners closed their shops early, eager to hear updates on the Silver Lake Resort project that had dominated community conversation since the previous night's vote. Frank Harrison heard the news from Maria Gonzalez, who ran the organic grocery that sold much of his produce. "They're saying it's about accelerating the construction timeline," she told him over the phone. "Apparently, they want to break ground next week instead of next month." Frank thanked her for the information, his voice betraying no emotion despite the knot forming in his stomach. The accelerated timeline would leave no opportunity for additional environmental reviews or water rights considerations, exactly as Mayor Chambers had intended. After ending the call, Frank stood in his kitchen for several long moments, debating his next move. His son James had asked him to wait, to give him time to make some calls. But if construction began next week, any intervention would come too late to prevent irreversible damage to the aquifer. Frank made his decision. He retrieved his leather folder from the desk, picked up his truck keys, and headed toward town. By 3:30 p.m., nearly 200 people had gathered in the town square. A temporary podium stood on the town hall steps, flanked by Apex Development, banners and a large architectural rendering of the completed resort. Camera crews from 2 regional news stations had set up equipment, a level of media attention Pinecrest rarely received. Mayor Chambers emerged from the building precisely at the scheduled time, accompanied by the Apex CEO and 3 members of the town council. His tailored navy suit and confident smile projected the image of successful leadership he had carefully cultivated. The crowd applauded as he approached the microphone. "Good afternoon, friends and neighbors," Chambers began, his voice carrying across the square. "Yesterday marked a historic moment for our community, and today I'm thrilled to announce that progress is already exceeding our expectations." Additional applause interrupted him momentarily before he continued. "Apex Development has informed me that based on our community's enthusiastic support, they've accelerated their investment timeline. Construction will begin next week, with the official groundbreaking ceremony this Friday at 10 a.m. Governor Williams will join us for this momentous occasion." The crowd's reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with scattered cheers and excited conversation. The mayor paused, allowing the news to sink in before delivering what he considered the keynote of his announcement. Additionally, Apex has expanded its initial hiring commitments. They will need 150 local workers for the construction phase, starting immediately, with wages beginning at $22 per hour. This news generated the loudest response yet. In a town where many jobs paid little more than minimum wage, the announcement represented life-changing opportunity for many families. As the cheering subsided, Frank Harrison's faded blue pickup truck pulled into a parking space at the edge of the square. Those standing nearby watched curiously as the elderly farmer emerged, carrying his leather folder. A few people nodded acknowledgement, but most deliberately avoided eye contact, not wanting to be associated with the town's most visible opponent to progress. Frank made his way slowly through the crowd, his tall frame and dignified bearing creating a natural path despite his unpopular position. He stopped at the edge of the gathering, listening as Mayor Chambers detailed the economic projections for the resort's first 5 years of operation. "In summary," the mayor concluded, "the Silver Lake Resort represents not just immediate jobs, but a sustainable economic future for Pinecrest. Our children and grandchildren will thank us for the vision we've shown in embracing this opportunity. I'll now take a few questions." Several hands shot up, and Chambers pointed to a local reporter first. "Mayor, can you address concerns about increased traffic through the historic downtown area once the resort is operational?" "Absolutely. The development includes funding for a bypass road that will direct resort traffic around the town center, protecting our historic district while still allowing visitors to access local businesses if they choose." The next question came from a business owner. "Will local contractors have priority for construction jobs?" "Yes, Apex has committed to hiring locally first, bringing in outside workers only for specialized roles that can't be filled within the community." Frank Harrison raised his hand, standing perfectly still among the shifting crowd. Mayor Chambers scanned the gathering, acknowledging several other raised hands, while conspicuously avoiding Frank's. After taking 4 questions, the mayor prepared to conclude the session. "If there are no further questions—" "Mayor Chambers," Frank called out, his deep voice carrying clearly across the square, "I'd like to ask about the water usage implications of the accelerated timeline." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Chambers' smile tightened almost imperceptibly as he found himself cornered into acknowledging Harrison's presence. "Mr. Harrison, I believe your concerns were addressed thoroughly during yesterday's council meeting and the preceding months of public comment periods." "With respect, Mayor, they were not," Frank replied evenly. "The council cut short my presentation before I could share critical data about the aquifer's condition. Given that construction is now being accelerated, it seems even more urgent that this information be considered." Chambers glanced at the Apex CEO, whose expression had darkened at the mention of water concerns. The mayor quickly calculated his options and decided that publicly dismissing Harrison again would only give oxygen to his objections. Mr. Harrison, while we appreciate your continued interest in the project, all environmental reviews have been completed according to state regulations. The appropriate time for raising these concerns was during the environmental impact study period, which concluded 3 months ago. Frank stood his ground. I submitted detailed comments during that period. They were acknowledged, but not addressed in the final report. I have documentation here showing that the water usage models used for the resort do not account for the actual measured decline in the aquifer over the past decade. Several people in the crowd began paying closer attention. Water was a perpetual concern in the region, and many remembered the severe drought 5 years earlier that had forced water rationing. Chambers sensed the shift in attention and moved to regain control of the narrative. The environmental impact studies were conducted by certified experts using the most current scientific methodologies. With all due respect to Mr. Harrison's personal observations, we must rely on professional assessments rather than anecdotal evidence. These aren't anecdotes, Frank responded, opening his folder and holding up a chart. These are 50 years of documented water table measurements taken monthly using USGS-approved methods. My family has maintained these records since 1973, and they show conclusively that the aquifer can't sustain the projected water usage during drought periods, which are occurring with increasing frequency. The mayor's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't anticipated Harrison showing up with documentation or speaking so authoritatively on technical matters. The older man's calm, reasoned approach was proving more difficult to dismiss than Chambers had expected. Mr. Harrison, this is neither the time nor the place for relitigating settled matters. If you have concerns about the environmental review process, you're welcome to pursue whatever legal remedies are available to you. However, this project has been approved through proper channels and will proceed as scheduled. Frank persisted, his voice remaining measured despite the dismissal. Victor, I've lived through 7 major droughts in this valley. During the last one, 3 farms had wells run dry by August. The resort's projected water usage is equivalent to irrigating an additional 600 acres of farmland. The aquifer simply cannot support that during low rainfall years. The use of the mayor's first name, a reminder of their long personal history, visibly irritated Chambers. His professional veneer slipped slightly as he responded with an edge to his voice. Frank, times change. Modern water management techniques aren't comparable to what was available during previous droughts. The resort will implement state-of-the-art conservation measures. Besides, if a few farms need to adjust their irrigation practices or switch to less water-intensive crops, that's simply part of progress. Attention settled over the crowd. The mayor's suggestion that farms should sacrifice for the resort contradicted his previous assurances that the development would benefit all sectors of the community equally. Frank seized on the inconsistency. So you acknowledge that there will be water shortages for existing farms. That wasn't mentioned in any of the public presentations about this project. Chambers realized his misstep and quickly attempted to recover. I was speaking hypothetically. The environmental impact report clearly states that with proper management, there will be sufficient water for all users. That's simply not supported by the historical data, Frank replied, his calm persistence increasingly frustrating the mayor. Mayor Chambers' patience had reached its limit. The press conference that was meant to celebrate accelerated progress had been hijacked by the very person he thought he'd silenced the night before. Worse still, he could see that some community members were now listening attentively to Harrison's concerns, their expressions shifting from dismissal to consideration. That's enough, Mr. Harrison. Chambers said, abandoning any pretense of collegiality. He gestured to two police officers who had been stationed at the perimeter of the gathering. "We're here to discuss the positive developments for our town, not entertain doomsday scenarios from those who refuse to embrace change." The officers hesitated briefly before approaching Frank, clearly uncomfortable with confronting the respected elderly farmer. Chief Williams, a lifelong Pinecrest resident, who had known the Harrison family for decades, stepped forward instead. "Frank, perhaps we should continue this discussion another time," he suggested quietly, attempting to diffuse the situation, but Mayor Chambers wasn't satisfied with this gentle approach. "This is an official town announcement, not an open forum for obstruction," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Harrison has had ample opportunity to present his concerns through proper channels." Frank stood his ground, despite the chief's hand now resting lightly on his arm. "I've tried those channels repeatedly, Victor. My concerns have been systematically ignored or dismissed without proper scientific evaluation. If you're so confident in your water assessments, why not allow an independent review before breaking ground? What's the rush?" The directness of the question struck a nerve. The accelerated timeline had been Apex's idea, motivated partly by their desire to begin construction before any potential obstacles could emerge. The mayor had eagerly agreed, seeing it as a way to create unstoppable momentum. Chambers' expression hardened as he abandoned diplomacy entirely. "The rush, Mr. Harrison, is to bring jobs and prosperity to people who need them now, not indefinitely delay progress because one stubborn farmer refuses to accept that his way of life is no longer economically viable." A palpable tension fell over the gathering. The mayor's words had crossed a line, attacking not just Frank's position, but his livelihood and identity. Several older residents who had remained silent now frowned in disapproval. The Gonzalez family, who depended on Harrison's organic produce for their grocery store, exchanged concerned glances. Frank's weathered face revealed little emotion, but those who knew him well could see the hurt in his eyes. Still, when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "This isn't about preserving my farm, Mayor. It's about protecting a water resource that dozens of families and businesses depend on. Once an aquifer is depleted beyond a certain point, it may never recover. That's not opinion, it's hydrological fact." "Facts?" Chambers scoffed, his frustration overriding his usual political instincts. "You stand there with your homemade charts and hand-scribbled notes and presume to challenge comprehensive studies conducted by professionals with advanced degrees. This town needs jobs and economic development, not amateur science lessons from someone whose education ended with a high school diploma 50 years ago." A collective intake of breath followed this personal attack. Even some of the mayor's supporters appeared uncomfortable with his tone. The Apex CEO subtly stepped back from the podium, creating physical distance from Chambers' increasingly hostile rhetoric. Chief Williams attempted again to ease tensions. "Mayor, perhaps we should—" "No," Chambers cut him off. "I'm tired of this persistent obstruction Master's concern. Let me be absolutely clear to everyone here. This project is moving forward. The council vote was unanimous. The environmental reviews are complete. The financing is secured." He fixed his gaze directly on Frank, his voice taking on a theatrical quality meant for the assembled media. "We don't need uneducated farmers in worn-out overalls holding up progress with their outdated concerns. This town deserves better than being held hostage to 19th century thinking in a 21st century economy." The cruelty of the words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke or moved. Frank Harrison stood perfectly still, his dignity in stark contrast to the mayor's barely contained contempt. Several cameras pivoted from the mayor to capture Frank's reaction, their operators sensing that this confrontation had just become the real story. A few people at the edges of the crowd began to whisper among themselves, uncomfortable with witnessing the public humiliation of a man who, regardless of his position on the resort, had served the community honorably for decades. When Frank finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "My overalls may be worn, Mayor Chambers, and my formal education limited, but neither diminishes the validity of the science I'm presenting. When your resort runs dry in its first drought year, remember that you chose insults over investigation." He carefully closed his leather folder, tucked it under his arm, and turned to leave. The crowd parted silently before him, many avoiding eye contact out of embarrassment or uncertainty. A few older residents nodded respectfully as he passed, small gestures of solidarity they hoped wouldn't be noticed by the mayor. Chambers watched Harrison's retreat with poorly concealed satisfaction. In his mind, he had won decisively, putting the troublesome farmer in his place and demonstrating to any other potential opponents the cost of challenging his vision for Pinecrest. "Now then," he said, his professional demeanor returning as Frank reached the edge of the square, "let's get back to discussing the exciting opportunities ahead. As I was saying, the groundbreaking ceremony will feature not only the governor, but also representatives from the State Tourism Board." The mayor continued his presentation, but the energy had shifted perceptibly. While many still appeared enthusiastic about the jobs and economic prospects, the confrontation had cast a shadow over the proceedings. Some participants glanced uncomfortably at each other, troubled by the unnecessary harshness of the mayor's attack. Others looked toward Harrison's departing figure with expressions that suggested the conflict had actually increased their interest in his concerns. Frank walked steadily to his truck, his back straight despite the public humiliation he had just endured. He placed his folder carefully on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back at the gathering. Only one person noticed that as he waited at the town square's single traffic light, he made a brief phone call. Susan Chen, the local librarian whose office window overlooked the street, saw him speaking intently for about 30 seconds before putting his phone away as the light changed. Back at the press conference, Mayor Chambers wrapped up his remarks with practiced enthusiasm, though he seemed eager to conclude the event after the unexpected confrontation. The Apex CEO made a brief statement emphasizing the company's commitment to responsible development, pointedly mentioning their state-of-the-art water management systems without directly addressing Harrison's concerns. As the crowd began to disperse, a small group of older residents gathered near the hardware store, speaking in hushed tones. "Never thought I'd see the day when speaking up at a town meeting would get you publicly ridiculed," said Henry Wilson, whose family had operated the town's feed store for 3 generations. "Frank's not one to make claims without substance," added Margaret Dawson, the retired high school science teacher. "I've known him for 40 years. If he says there's a water issue, there likely is." "Doesn't matter now," replied Wilson with a resigned shrug. "The mayor's made up his mind, and the council follows his lead. Nothing's going to stop this project." Little did they know how dramatically wrong that assessment would prove to be. As evening settled over Pinecrest, 2 significant conversations were taking place. In his penthouse apartment, Mayor Chambers sat with the Apex CEO, sharing an expensive bottle of scotch as they reviewed the day's events. "Harrison's intervention was unfortunate," the CEO remarked, "but I don't think it will gain traction. The jobs argument is simply too compelling for most residents." "Exactly," Chambers agreed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "By this time tomorrow, everyone will have moved on to discussing employment applications and economic benefits. Harrison's moment has passed." 15 miles away, in the quiet of his farmhouse, Frank Harrison sat at his kitchen table, his folder open before him. The call he had made from his truck had been brief but consequential. Now he waited, reviewing his data one more time to ensure everything was properly documented. His son had been clear. "Don't do anything more tonight, Dad. Just go home and wait. Things will be different tomorrow, I promise." Frank wasn't entirely sure what James meant by that, but he trusted his son's judgment. For the first time since the town meeting began, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps his concerns would receive proper consideration after all. Darkness had settled over Harrison family farms as Frank sat alone on his porch swing. The gentle creaking of aged wood accompanied the chorus of crickets and nightbirds that had provided the soundtrack to countless evenings of contemplation throughout his life. Tonight, however, the familiar sounds failed to bring their usual comfort. The events at the town square had left a deeper wound than he cared to admit. It wasn't the public humiliation that troubled him most, though that had certainly stung, but the realization that his community had changed in ways he hadn't fully comprehended until today. Neighbors who had known him for decades had stood silently while the mayor dismissed decades of careful observation and record-keeping as the irrelevant musings of an uneducated relic. Frank took a sip from his mug of herbal tea, his wife Martha's remedy for troubled times. She had been gone 5 years now, taken by the cancer that had come swiftly and shown no mercy. He often wondered what she would advise in situations like this. Martha had possessed a wisdom about people that complemented his understanding of the land. Together, they had navigated the community's evolving dynamics far better than he managed alone. "What would you do, Martha?" he murmured to the night air. "Keep fighting or let it go?" Inside the farmhouse, his phone rang, interrupting his reverie. Frank rose stiffly, muscles protesting after a long day of both farm work and emotional strain, and made his way inside. The caller ID displayed James Harrison. "Hello, son," he answered, settling into his kitchen chair. "Dad," James began, his voice carrying the clipped precision that had become habitual during his military career. "I've been making calls all afternoon. I need you to fill me in on exactly what happened today." Frank recounted the confrontation at the town square, keeping his description factual and avoiding emotional language despite the hurt he still felt. James listened without interruption until his father had finished. "They're breaking ground on Friday?" James confirmed, his tone shifting to something Frank recognized from past discussions of military operations. Focused, strategic. "That's what the mayor announced. The governor's coming for the ceremony." "Not anymore," James replied. "I've just gotten off the phone with Governor Williams' chief of staff. The governor's office has been informed of potential environmental complications and will be postponing their participation pending further review." Frank sat up straighter. "How did you manage that?" "Let's just say that certain federal agencies take water resource issues very seriously, particularly when they might affect national security interests." "National security? James, what are you talking about?" His son's voice softened slightly. "Dad, I haven't been completely forthcoming about my current position. For the past 3 years, I've been heading a special division within the Department of Defense focused on resource security, particularly water, rare earth minerals, and agricultural land with unique properties. My team assesses threats to these resources, whether foreign or domestic." Frank absorbed this information slowly. He had known his son held a significant position at the Pentagon, but James had always been vague about the details, citing security classifications. "I'm still not sure I understand how this connects to Silver Lake Resort," Frank admitted. "The aquifer that feeds your farm and the others in Pinecrest Valley isn't just any water source," James explained. "It has unique mineral properties that make it valuable for certain specialized applications. We've been monitoring it for years as part of our strategic resource inventory." Frank's mind raced back through decades of farming experience. "The high selenium content," he said suddenly. "Is that what makes it special?" "Among other trace elements, yes. The specific combination is extremely rare. That's why I need your data, Dad. If Apex's development threatens this resource, I have the authority to initiate a federal review that would temporarily halt construction pending a full hydrological assessment. For the first time since the town meeting, Frank felt a surge of hope. His years of meticulous record-keeping might actually make a difference after all. I've documented everything, he assured his son. Water table levels, mineral composition tests from the University Extension Service, historical flow rates during drought cycles. It's all here. Good, James replied. Now listen carefully. I'll be arriving tomorrow morning with a small team. We'll need to move quickly to establish federal jurisdiction before Friday's groundbreaking. I don't want you to contact anyone or discuss this with anyone in town tonight. Can you do that for me? Of course, Frank agreed, though the request seemed unnecessary. Few people in Pinecrest were speaking to him after today's confrontation. Get some rest, Dad, James said, his voice warming. Things will look different tomorrow, I promise. As Frank ended the call, he sat motionless at his kitchen table, processing this unexpected development. His son, the boy who had left Pinecrest at 18, swearing never to return to what he called dirt farming, was now in a position to potentially save not just Harrison family farms, but all the agricultural operations that depended on the aquifer. The irony wasn't lost on him. His son had rejected farming only to end up protecting the very resources that made farming possible. Life had a way of coming full circle in the most unexpected ways. Across town in his penthouse apartment, Mayor Victor Chambers was finishing his third scotch while reviewing media coverage of the day's events on his laptop. Most local outlets had focused on the jobs announcement and accelerated timeline, mentioning the confrontation with Harrison only briefly. One regional newspaper, however, had featured a photograph of Frank standing tall among the crowd, his weathered face composed despite the mayor's visible anger. The caption read, "Local farmer Frank Harrison questions water sustainability of Silver Lake Resort project despite public rebuke from Mayor Chambers." Chambers closed the laptop with more force than necessary. The narrative was supposed to be about progress and opportunity, not environmental concerns. He had hoped that publicly humiliating Harrison would discourage others from raising similar objections. But the dignified way the old farmer had handled the confrontation might actually have generated sympathy. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from the Apex CEO. Governor's office just called. They're postponing Friday's appearance. Cited scheduling conflict. Should we be concerned? Chambers stared at the message, a knot forming in his stomach. The governor's participation had been confirmed weeks ago and reconfirmed just that morning. Sudden cancellations like this usually signaled political complications. Had Harrison somehow made contact with someone in the state government? He quickly typed a response. Probably nothing. We'll call them first thing tomorrow and sort it out. Setting. Down his phone, Chambers walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows and gazed out at the sleeping town below. The Silver Lake Resort represented everything he had promised Pinecrest during his campaign: economic revitalization, job creation, and a new identity for a community that had been slowly dying for decades. He couldn't allow one stubborn farmer's outdated concerns to derail this vision. Tomorrow he would contact his connections at the State Environmental Agency, remind them of the thorough review process the project had already undergone, and ensure that no last-minute complications arose. The groundbreaking would proceed as planned, with or without the governor. As both men prepared for sleep that night, Frank in his century-old farmhouse, Chambers in his modern penthouse, neither could have anticipated how dramatically their confrontation would escalate in the hours ahead. The battle over Pinecrest's future was about to move far beyond a town hall meeting or public square confrontation. In Washington, D.C., General James Harrison was assembling a team of specialists for immediate deployment to Pinecrest. His father's Water data had provided the justification he needed to initiate a resource protection assessment, a rarely used but powerful federal process that could temporarily supersede local development approvals on national security grounds. By dawn, 3 military helicopters would be airborne, carrying not just James, but a team of hydrologists, environmental engineers, and legal specialists prepared to evaluate the aquifer's significance and the potential impact of the Silver Lake resort. On this newly classified strategic resource, the mayor's dismissive treatment of Frank Harrison, the uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls, was about to trigger consequences far beyond anything Victor Chambers could have imagined when he orchestrated his triumphant press conference in the town square. Morning in Pinecrest arrived, with a crystalline clarity that showcased the valley's natural beauty. Sunlight gilded the surrounding hills, illuminating patches of forest interspersed with the geometric patterns of cultivated fields. It was the kind of day that reminded residents why generations had chosen to make this landscape their home, despite the economic challenges of recent decades. At Harrison Family Farms, Frank had been awake since 4:30 a.m., completing his morning chores with the same methodical attention he applied every day, regardless of personal circumstances. The rhythms of agricultural life didn't pause for town politics or personal humiliation. Animals needed feeding, irrigation systems required checking, and the early summer crops demanded attention. By 7 a.m., he had finished the essential work and returned to the farmhouse to prepare for his son's arrival. James hadn't specified exactly when he would arrive or by what means, saying only that it would be morning and that Frank should have his documentation ready. The leather folder containing 50 years of water table measurements sat on the kitchen table alongside a more recent addition, a USB drive containing digitized records and computer models created with help from the Agricultural Extension Service. Frank had spent the early morning hours organizing everything, wanting to ensure that when federal specialists reviewed his data, they would find it methodical and professional, despite the mayor's characterization of his work as amateur science. In town, the day was beginning with unusual energy. News of the resort's accelerated timeline had generated excitement, with many residents already inquiring about job applications. The local diner buzzed with conversation about potential positions, training opportunities, and the economic ripple effects that would benefit existing businesses. Mayor Chambers entered Pinecrest Coffee House at 7:45 a.m., earlier than his usual appearance. The previous night's concerns about the governor's cancellation had disturbed his sleep, and he had decided to get an early start on damage control. Several patrons greeted him enthusiastically, eager to express their support for the resort project and ask about employment procedures. Chambers answered their questions with practiced charm while scanning the room for any sign of dissent. He was relieved to see no evidence of Harrison or his supporters. The confrontation at yesterday's press conference appeared to have isolated the elderly farmer further, exactly as intended. The mayor collected his large Americano and was heading toward the door when his phone rang. The screen displayed Governor's office. Victor Chambers, he answered, stepping outside for privacy. Mayor Chambers, this is Elliot Sanders, the governor's chief of staff. The voice was formal, lacking the collegial tone that had characterized their previous conversations. Elliot, good morning. I was planning to call you about the governor's schedule change for Friday. That's precisely why I'm calling, Sanders replied. The governor wants to be absolutely clear that this is not merely a scheduling conflict. He's been advised that there may be significant environmental complications with the Silver Lake project that weren't adequately addressed in the approval process. Chambers felt his confidence falter. What complications? The environmental impact study was comprehensive and found no significant issues. We've met every regulatory requirement at both local and state levels. I understand that's your position, Sanders said carefully. However, we've received communication from the federal level expressing concerns specifically related to the aquifer and its potential classification as a strategic resource. Until this matter is clarified, the governor cannot associate himself with the groundbreaking ceremony. Federal level? Chambers repeated, struggling to comprehend how a local development project had suddenly attracted national attention. What? Federal agency is involved. There was a slight pause before Sanders answered. I'm not at liberty to provide those details at this time. I'd suggest you prepare for possible federal representatives to make contact today. That's all I can say. The call ended before Chambers could press for more information. He stood motionless on the sidewalk, coffee forgotten in his hand. Mind racing to identify how Harrison might have connected with federal authorities. The old farmer had mentioned submitting concerns during the environmental review process, but those had been evaluated and dismissed by the consulting firm Apex had hired. Could there be something legitimate in Harrison's water concerns that their experts had missed? Or was this simply bureaucratic interference, triggered by someone with connections using procedural tactics to delay the project? Either way, Chambers needed to alert Apex immediately. He pulled out his phone to call the CEO when an unfamiliar sound drew his attention skyward. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley, growing rapidly louder. Throughout Pinecrest, people stepped outside shops and homes, shading their eyes against the morning sun as they searched for the source of the unusual noise. 3 black helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge, flying in tight formation at low altitude. Military aircraft were an uncommon sight in Pinecrest, appearing occasionally during National Guard exercises, but never directly over the town itself. As residents watched in growing curiosity, the helicopters altered course slightly, heading directly toward Harrison Family Farms on the valley's western edge. Inside the lead helicopter, General James Harrison reviewed final details with his team. At 47, he carried himself with the confident authority that came from 25 years of military service and progressive leadership responsibility. His weathered features reflected his father's genetics, though his closely cropped salt and pepper hair and precisely tailored uniform created a stark contrast to Frank's casual farming attire. Remember, this is an assessment mission, not an enforcement. Action, he reminded the assembled specialists. Our jurisdiction is limited to determining whether this aquifer qualifies for strategic resource protection under Executive Order 14 UT 789. We gather data, document conditions, and make preliminary recommendations. Nothing more at this stage. The hydrologist seated across from him nodded. The initial review of Mr. Harrison's data is promising. If his measurements are accurate, this aquifer has several unique characteristics that would qualify it for protection. His measurements will be accurate, James stated with absolute confidence. My father may not have a scientific degree, but he's more methodical than most researchers I've worked with. The helicopters began their descent toward the open field, adjacent to the Harrison farmhouse. Through the window, James could see his father standing in the yard, watching their approach with a hand shielding his eyes from the morning sun. The sight of the familiar figure, straight back despite his years, patient and unflappable, even as military helicopters landed on his property, stirred unexpected emotion in the general. It had been nearly 2 years since he had last visited Pinecrest, and even that brief Christmas stay had been cut short by an international crisis, requiring his immediate return to Washington. The farm represented complicated memories, the place he had desperately wanted to escape as a teenager, viewing it as a limitation rather than a heritage. yet also the foundation that had shaped his character and work ethic. As the helicopters touched down in sequence, stirring up dust that swirled around the landing zone, James saw his father waiting calmly at a safe distance. Frank had experienced enough in his long life that even the dramatic arrival of military aircraft on his property didn't fluster him. Across town, the landing had created an immediate sensation. Within minutes, social media was flooded with photos and videos of the 3 black helicopters descending on Harrison family farms. Speculation ran wild as residents tried to understand the sudden military presence in their community. Mayor Chambers watched the footage on his phone with growing alarm. Whatever federal interest had been expressed to the governor's office had now manifested in the most visible way possible. The timing, the day after his public confrontation with Frank Harrison, created an optics nightmare for his administration. "Victor, what the hell is happening?" demanded the Apex CEO, who had called immediately after seeing the helicopter footage. "Why are military aircraft landing at the Harrison farm?" "I'm trying to find out," Chambers replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "The governor's office mentioned something about federal concerns regarding the aquifer as a strategic resource, but I don't have details yet." Strategic resource? It's groundwater for a farming community, not uranium, the CEO scoffed, though his voice betrayed genuine concern. "This has to be Harrison pulling strings somewhere. Find out who he knows and get this shut down. We're too close to groundbreaking to deal with federal interference." Chambers ended the call and immediately phoned the town's legal counsel. If federal agencies were attempting to intervene in a properly approved local development, he needed to understand the legal implications immediately. As he waited for the call to connect, he watched another video appear on his feed. This one, showing a man in military uniform emerging from the lead helicopter and embracing Frank Harrison. The mayor's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. The commanding officer leading whatever federal intervention was underway was embracing the very farmer Chambers had publicly humiliated the day before. The pieces suddenly connected with devastating clarity. "James Harrison," he murmured, remembering. The mayor from 2 administrations ago, mentioning that Frank's son had achieved significant rank in the military. Chambers had dismissed it as small-town exaggeration at the time, never bothering to verify the information or consider its potential relevance. Now, as he stared at the unmistakable evidence of Francis Harrison's powerful connections, Mayor Victor, Chambers realized that his dismissive treatment of the uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls might prove to be the most catastrophic miscalculation of his political career. By 9:30 a.m., Pinecrest was in the grip of unprecedented excitement. Word of the military helicopters had spread throughout the community with the velocity that only small-town communication networks can achieve. Residents gathered in clusters on Main Street, sharing videos and speculating about the sudden federal interest in their town. The most common theory connected the military arrival with the Silver Lake Resort project, but no one could explain exactly how or why. At Harrison Family Farms, a temporary command center had been established in the large barn that normally housed tractors and farm equipment. Tables arranged in a horseshoe formation held computers, satellite communication equipment, and scientific instruments. Military personnel in uniform worked alongside civilians in professional attire, creating an incongruous scene against the backdrop of aged wooden beams and generations of accumulated farm implements. Frank Harrison watched with quiet amazement as his son directed the operation with practiced efficiency. The shy boy, who had struggled to deliver his high school graduation speech, had transformed into a commanding officer whose instructions were followed without question. In the 30 years since James had left Pinecrest, father and son had maintained their relationship primarily through holiday visits and occasional phone calls. Frank had never witnessed his son in his professional element until today. "Your documentation is impressively thorough, Mr. Harrison," commented Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, the lead hydrologist. She had spent the past hour reviewing Frank's leather folder of water table measurements and comparing them with satellite imagery and USGS data. "These readings align perfectly with our remote sensing data, but provide much greater temporal resolution than anything we've collected." Frank nodded acknowledgement of the compliment. "When you depend on something for your livelihood, you pay attention to its patterns. Exactly why local knowledge is invaluable," Rodriguez agreed. "We can develop sophisticated models, but they're only as good as the ground truth data they're built upon." Across the barn, James Harrison finished a call on a secure satellite phone and approached his father. "The Resource Protection Assessment Team is establishing a perimeter for water sampling at the proposed resort site," he explained. "Mayor Chambers has been officially notified that all development activities are temporarily suspended, pending our evaluation." Frank's expression remained neutral. "How's he taking it?" "About as well as you'd expect," James replied with a slight smile. "He's already contacted the State Attorney General's office to challenge our jurisdiction. It won't get him anywhere. Executive Order 14789 is quite clear about federal authority over potential strategic resources." "And is our aquifer truly a strategic resource?" Frank asked, still trying to fully understand the basis for this extraordinary intervention. James glanced at Rodriguez, who nodded and pulled up a chart on her tablet. "The mineral composition of your aquifer is genuinely unique, Mr. Harrison," she explained. "The particular combination of selenium, lithium, and several rare earth elements occurs in only 3 known groundwater systems nationwide. These elements are critical for certain advanced defense technologies, which is why they fall under strategic resource classification." Frank absorbed this information slowly. The water he had used for irrigation all his life, that his father and grandfather had pumped from the same wells, was apparently valuable beyond its life-sustaining properties. If that's true, why hasn't anyone from the government mentioned this before? We've been farming here for generations. The strategic importance of these elements has only recently been recognized, James explained. New defense applications, developed in the past 5 years, have dramatically increased demand for these specific combinations. My division began cataloging potential domestic sources 18 months ago. So it's coincidence that this happened just as the resort was about to break ground? Frank asked skeptically. James met his father's gaze directly. Let's call it fortunate timing. The aquifer would have been assessed eventually, but your call accelerated our timeline. The resort's potential impact on the water table gave us legitimate grounds for immediate intervention. Before their conversation could continue, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the barn's open doors, they could see a black SUV with town insignia pulling up beside the temporary security checkpoint established by military personnel at the farm's entrance. Mayor Victor Chambers emerged from the vehicle, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of haste, tie slightly askew, hair not perfectly combed. The security officers checked his identification and spoke into their radios, apparently requesting permission for his entry. James watched the interaction with professional detachment. I was wondering how long it would take him to show up personally. Frank straightened his shoulders unconsciously. What happens now? Now, Dad, James replied. Mayor Chambers learns who you really are. Not just an uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls, but someone whose methodical observations and documentation may have saved a nationally significant resource. And incidentally, the father of the federal officer who has authority to halt his prized development project. For the first time since the confrontation in the town square, Frank Harrison allowed himself a small smile. He had never sought vindication, or revenge against Chambers, only a fair hearing for his legitimate concerns. But he was human enough to appreciate the poetic justice unfolding before him. "Should I change into my Sunday clothes?" Frank asked, with a hint of humor. James chuckled, recognizing his father's rare display of irony. "No, Dad. The overalls are perfect. Let's go greet the mayor." The security checkpoint officers escorted Mayor Chambers across the gravel driveway toward the barn where Frank and James Harrison awaited his arrival. The mayor's attempt to project confident authority was undermined by subtle signs of distress, a light sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the mild morning temperature, the slightly too rapid pace of his walking, and the unconscious adjustment of his tie as he approached. James Harrison stepped forward to meet him, every inch the military officer in his crisp uniform, adorned with the insignia of his rank and the decorations earned through decades of service. Behind him stood Frank, deliberately remaining in his work clothes, the very overalls that had been mocked just 24 hours earlier. "Mayor Chambers," James greeted him with formal correctness, neither warm nor openly hostile. "I'm General James Harrison, Special Division for Resource Security, Department of Defense. Thank you for coming promptly." Chambers faltered momentarily, before extending his hand. "General Harrison, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware the Department of Defense had interests in Pinecrest. Our interest is specific to the aquifer system that underlies this valley," James explained, maintaining professional detachment. "Preliminary assessment indicates it contains mineral compositions considered strategically significant under Executive Order 14789. The mayor's eyes darted between James and Frank, the family resemblance now unmistakable despite their different attire and bearing. "I see, and this assessment was initiated when exactly?" "The aquifer has been on our monitoring list for 18 months, James replied. "The accelerated on-site evaluation was triggered by documented concerns about potential disruption to the water table from the Silver Lake Development Project." Chambers struggled to maintain his composure. "Documented concerns? You mean Mr. Harrison's personal observations?" "With all due respect, General, our project has undergone extensive environmental review by certified experts." "Yes, I've reviewed those materials," James acknowledged. "They appear to have overlooked several critical factors, particularly regarding drought cycle impacts on the mineral concentration levels, factors that are thoroughly documented in my father's 50 years of consistent measurements." The mayor's attention shifted to Frank, who had yet to speak. The elderly farmer stood with quiet dignity, the leather folder of water measurements held casually at his side. His expression remained neutral, neither triumphant nor accusatory, simply present as the situation unfolded. "Mr. Harrison," Chambers began, his tone noticeably more respectful than during their previous encounter, "I had no idea your concerns had federal implications. Had you mentioned your son's position, would it have made a difference?" Frank asked simply. "Should a farmer need a general for a son to have his evidence examined properly?" The directness of the question left Chambers momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, Dr. Rodriguez approached with a tablet displaying preliminary test results. "General Harrison, our initial water samples confirm the selenium levels match historical records. The aquifer clearly qualifies for strategic resource designation under Section 4 of the Executive Order." James nodded acknowledgement before turning back to the increasingly uncomfortable mayor. "Mayor Chambers, this means all development activities that might impact the aquifer are suspended pending a complete federal assessment. I'm implementing a 60-day moratorium on groundbreaking for the Silver Lake Resort effective immediately." 6 months after the dramatic arrival of military helicopters in Pinecrest, the community gathered once again in the town hall. The chamber, which had witnessed Frank Harrison's dismissal and humiliation during the initial Silver Lake Resort vote, now hosted a very different meeting. The renovated space had been reconfigured with a large central table surrounded by seating for public attendance. Gone was the elevated podium that had physically separated officials from citizens, replaced by an arrangement that encouraged collaboration rather than pronouncement. Mayor Victor Chambers sat at the table alongside Frank Harrison, General James. Harrison, in civilian clothes, representatives from Apex Development, environmental specialists and community leaders from both agricultural and business sectors. The seating arrangement itself told the story of how dramatically things had changed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chambers began, his tone markedly different from the triumphant declarations of previous meetings. "Today marks the culmination of 6 months of intensive collaboration on the Pinecrest Sustainable Development Initiative. What began as a confrontation has evolved into something I believe will benefit our community far more than the original proposal." The revised plan displayed on the large screens bore little resemblance to the original Silver Lake resort concept. Instead of a massive development concentrated around the lake, the new design distributed smaller hospitality and recreation facilities throughout the valley, each carefully positioned to minimize impact on the aquifer while maximizing economic opportunities for existing businesses. The modified water management plan has been approved by both the Department of Defense Resource Division and state environmental authorities, explained Dr. Rodriguez, who had remained in Pinecrest as a consulting hydrologist. By implementing advanced conservation technologies and restructuring usage priorities during drought periods, we can sustain both agricultural operations and tourism development without depleting the aquifer. Frank Harrison, now serving as co-chair of the Valley's newly established Water Management Board, nodded in agreement. The past 6 months had transformed his role in the community from isolated critic to respected advisor. His decades of water table measurements had become the foundation for the comprehensive management system now being implemented. Most remarkable was Mayor Chambers' evolution. The public humiliation of discovering Frank's son's identity and authority had initially triggered defensiveness and resentment. But as federal involvement made the resort's original design untenable, Chambers had faced a choice: continue fighting a losing battle or demonstrate leadership by embracing a new approach. To many people's surprise, including Frank's, the mayor had chosen the latter path. After the initial shock subsided, Chambers had approached the Harrisons with a proposal to collaborate on a revised development plan that would respect the aquifer's importance while still bringing economic opportunity to Pinecrest. The Sustainable Valley Initiative will create approximately 180 jobs over the next 3 years, Chambers explained to the gathered community. While that's fewer than the original resort projection, these positions will be more evenly distributed among existing businesses and new enterprises, creating more sustainable growth patterns. What Chambers didn't mention publicly, though many suspected, was how the confrontation had forced him to reconsider his dismissive attitude toward local knowledge. The uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls had proven more scientifically rigorous than the expensive consultants whose reports he had accepted without question. As the presentation concluded, Frank glanced at his son sitting nearby. James had taken extended leave to help implement the Aquifer Protection Program, spending more time in Pinecrest during the past 6 months than in the previous decade combined. The crisis had unexpectedly healed old wounds between them, creating opportunities for conversations that should have happened years earlier. When the floor opened for public comments, the first speaker was Margaret Dawson, the retired science teacher. 6 months ago, this town was divided between those who saw progress only in new development and those who valued only traditional agriculture, she observed. Today's plan suggests we've finally recognized that true sustainability requires both innovation and respect for historical knowledge. It's about time. The applause that followed reflected a community finding its way toward reconciliation after near-catastrophic division. 15 years after military helicopters landed on Harrison family farms, Pinecrest Valley had transformed in ways few residents could have imagined during those tense days of confrontation. The National Strategic Resources Conference, held in Washington, D.C., buzzed with activity as representatives from communities across the country gathered to share innovations in resource management. Among the featured presentations was a case study titled The Pinecrest Model: Balancing Economic Development with Resource Protection. The grand ballroom of the conference center was filled to capacity as Frank Harrison, now 83 but still straight-backed and clear-eyed, took the stage, alongside former Mayor Victor Chambers. The sight of these once bitter opponents now presenting as colleagues still surprised those who remembered their public confrontation years earlier. 15 years ago, Frank began, his voice carrying the weathered authority of his years, I was escorted out of a town meeting for trying to share concerns about our aquifer. That confrontation could have divided our community permanently, but instead became the catalyst for a collaborative approach that has been adopted by rural communities nationwide. Behind them, slides displayed the evolution of Pinecrest Valley, from the initial proposed Silver Lake Resort to the distributed development that now characterized the region. Small, architecturally distinctive lodges dotted the landscape, connected by nature trails and farm-to-table restaurants that showcase local agricultural products. Water-efficient technologies developed specifically for the Aquifer Protection Program had been commercialized and exported to similar communities facing water challenges. The Sustainable Valley Initiative has created 340 jobs, Chambers added, the precise number reflecting his continued attention to economic metrics. More significantly, these jobs span multiple sectors: tourism, technology, agriculture, and education, providing resilience during economic fluctuations that single industry development lacks. What neither man emphasized, though many in the audience knew, was how profoundly the experience had changed them personally. Chambers had completed his term as mayor before transitioning to head the Rural Innovation Institute, an organization dedicated to helping agricultural communities develop economically without sacrificing their environmental or cultural heritage. His transformation from development at all costs advocate to sustainability champion had been genuine and complete. Frank Harrison had evolved as well, moving beyond his initial defensive posture to embrace selective innovation while maintaining his commitment to resource protection. Harrison Family Farms now served as both a working agricultural operation and an educational center, where farmers learned water conservation practices alongside traditional growing methods. The most valuable outcome wasn't the specific development plan, Frank explained to the audience, but the governance model that emerged from the crisis. The Pinecrest Resource Council brought together perspectives that had previously been siloed: agricultural, commercial, scientific, and governmental, creating solutions that no single group could have developed alone. In the front row sat General James Harrison, recently retired after a distinguished military career and now dividing his time between Washington advisory roles and working alongside his father on the family farm. The confrontation 15 years earlier had reconnected him with his agricultural heritage, healing the breach between his chosen path and his family history. After the presentation, a graduate student approached Frank with a question that cut to the heart of the Pinecrest story. What would have happened if your son hadn't been in a position to intervene with federal authority? Would anyone have listened to your concerns? Frank considered the question thoughtfully before answering. The intervention created a moment of forced listening, but what mattered more was what people heard once they started paying attention. The data spoke for itself. Sometimes truth just needs a powerful enough megaphone to be heard above the noise. As the conference continued, communities from across the country sought advice from the Pinecrest representatives, eager to implement similar collaborative approaches to their own resource challenges. What had begun as one farmer's desperate attempt to protect a water source had evolved into a nationally recognized model for sustainable rural development. The uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls had ultimately educated an entire generation of community leaders about the value of integrating historical knowledge with forward-looking innovation, a legacy far more significant than simply winning a single confrontation. 25 years after the confrontation that changed Pinecrest Valley forever, a special ceremony took place at the newly established Pinecrest Environmental Studies Center. The modern building, with its innovative water capture design and solar arrays, stood on a gentle rise overlooking both the town and the surrounding farmland. The gathering included 3 generations of valley residents. Elder community members who remembered the original confrontation mingled with young professionals who had grown up during the transformation, and children who had known only the balanced, sustainable Pinecrest that had emerged from that pivotal moment. At the center of the ceremony stood a simple bronze sculpture depicting 2 figures in conversation, one in overalls holding a folder of documents, the other in business attire, listening attentively. The plaque beneath it read, "Common ground where wisdom meets progress." Frank Harrison, now 93, sat in a place of honor, his once tall frame slightly bent with age, but his blue eyes still clear and observant. Beside him sat Victor Chambers, 77, leaning on a cane but maintaining the polished appearance that had always characterized him. Dr. Lisa Montgomery, the center's first director and a nationally recognized environmental policy expert, approached the podium to begin the dedication. 25 years ago, 2 men stood as adversaries in our town hall, she began. One representing traditional knowledge accumulated through generations of careful observation, the other championing economic progress and development. Their conflict could have torn this community apart. Instead, it became the foundation for something remarkable, a new way of thinking about the relationship between tradition and innovation, between human needs and natural systems. The audience nodded in recognition of this familiar story, now part of Pinecrest's cultural identity. The Harrison Chambers Collaborative Governance Model has been implemented in over 40 rural communities nationwide, Montgomery continued. Not because federal intervention forced its adoption, but because it works. It creates prosperity while protecting resources, honors historical knowledge while embracing innovation, and transforms potential adversaries into essential partners. In the front row, James Harrison, now in his 70s, listened with quiet satisfaction. His military career had taken him around the world, addressing resource conflicts, but nothing had proven more meaningful than the transformation that had begun in his hometown. What had started as a son's protective instinct had evolved into a lifelong commitment to bridging the divide between traditional knowledge and modern governance. After the formal speeches concluded, Frank and Victor were invited to unveil the sculpture together. The 2 elderly men rose carefully, each assisted by family members, and moved toward the draped bronze figures that represented their journey from confrontation to collaboration. As they pulled the covering away together, revealing the artwork, for the first time, Victor turned toward Frank with a wry smile. "You know, I still think about that day in the town square when I dismissed you as an uneducated farmer in worn-out overalls. Probably the most embarrassing mistake of my life." Frank chuckled softly. "And I still have those overalls, kept them as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" asked one of Frank's great-grandchildren who had overheard the exchange. Frank considered the question for a moment before answering. That appearances rarely tell the whole story, that knowledge comes in many forms, and that sometimes the people we're quickest to dismiss are the very ones we most need to hear. As the gathering transitioned to a community celebration, young environmental science students eagerly sought wisdom from both men, no longer seeing them as representatives of opposing philosophies, but as complementary voices in a necessary conversation. The confrontation that had begun with humiliation and dismissal had ultimately yielded something profound, not just for Pinecrest Valley, but for communities facing similar challenges nationwide. It demonstrated that progress need not come at the expense of wisdom, that economic development and resource protection could reinforce rather than oppose each other, and that even the most bitter conflicts could, with courage and openness, become catalysts for transformation. The elderly farmer, who had once been mockingly dismissed for his worn overalls, and the ambitious mayor who had done the dismissing, now sat together as honored elders, their reconciliation embodying the very integration of perspectives their community had come to represent. Their story, beginning with conflict but evolving toward resolution, offered hope to a world increasingly divided between those who honored tradition and those who championed change, a reminder that the most sustainable path forward often requires both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.